Everybody knows Abraham and Sarah, the old couple who waited 100 years for one son, the barren wife who laughed when God said she'd have a baby, the father of the faith, standing under the stars, while God promises him descendants beyond counting. That's the story. Abraham, Sarah, Isaac. 3 people, 1 family. The end. Except that is not the end, because after Sarah dies, after the great love story is over, after the one promised son is grown and married, the book of Genesis drops a single sentence that most people have read 100 times and never once stopped on. Abraham took another wife. Her name was Keturah. Another wife, a second marriage, tucked into the story of the most famous marriage in the Bible, and almost nobody can tell you a single thing about her. The church that preaches Sarah every Christmas and pities Hagar every Sunday goes completely silent on the third woman in Abraham's life. And here is what makes that silence so strange. This forgotten footnote did not give Abraham one more child. She gave him 6 sons. And out of those 6 sons came entire nations that shaped the rest of the Bible, including one that Moses himself would marry into. So here are the questions this video is going to answer. Who was Keturah, really? And why does the Bible seem almost embarrassed to talk about her? How does a man the New Testament calls as good as dead, a man who couldn't father a child at 100, turn around and father 6 more sons after the age of 140? What happened to those 6 sons and to the nations that came out of them? And why did the writer of Genesis mention them at all, only to push them off the page a few verses later and send them east into the desert, out of the story forever? Because when you actually stop on these 5 verses that everyone skips, you find one of the most quietly staggering things in the entire book of Genesis. The promise God made to Abraham, the one everybody quotes, was not finished with Isaac. It was still being paid out, through a marriage nobody remembers, to a woman whose name means something you will not believe when you hear it. Let's get into it. Let's start where the story actually sits, because the location of these verses is half the mystery. Open your Bible to the 25th chapter of Genesis, and notice what just happened right before it. In chapter 23, Sarah dies. Abraham buys a cave and buries her, and the text lingers on his grief. The great matriarch gone, the man who walked with her out of Ur, now standing over her grave. In chapter 24, the longest single chapter in Genesis, Abraham sends his servant to find a wife for Isaac, and the servant comes back with Rebekah, and the son is comforted after his mother's death. That is the emotional climax. The promised son is married. The next generation is secure. As a story, it feels finished. Sarah is buried, Isaac is settled, and you can almost hear the music swelling to end the whole Abraham saga right there. But it doesn't end. Because the very next thing the text does, in the first verse of chapter 25, is this. Abraham took another wife, and her name was Keturah. No fanfare. No angel, no vision, no covenant ceremony under the stars. Just a plain sentence, dropped in after the funeral and the wedding, telling you that the old man was not done living. He married again. And then comes the list. Keturah bore him 6 sons, and the text names every one of them: Zimran, Jokshan, Medan, Midian, Ishbak, and Shua. 6 sons. From a marriage the story treated as an afterthought. And it keeps going into a second generation. Jokshan fathered Sheba and Dedan. Midian fathered 5 sons of his own: Ephah, Hanoch, Abidah, and Eldah. In the space of about 4 verses, one forgotten woman produces an entire branching family tree, sons and grandsons, a whole cluster of names spreading out from Abraham's tent. Now here is the first thing that should stop you. Think about how much the Bible has already made you wait for children in this exact family. For 25 chapters, the entire drama of Abraham's life has been one agonizing question. Will he have a son? Sarah is barren. The years drag on. God keeps promising, and the womb keeps staying empty. Abraham is 75 when the promise starts. He is 86 when he has Ishmael through Hagar. He is 100, a full 100 years old, when Isaac is finally born. And by then having even one child is treated as a laugh-out-loud, impossible, God-sized miracle. One son took 100 years and the direct intervention of heaven. And then, a few chapters later, almost in passing, the same man has 6 more. 6. Without commentary, without a single miracle announced. The book that spent 100 years and 25 chapters getting Abraham one child now hands him half a dozen in a sentence and a half, and moves on as if it were nothing. That contrast alone should make you lean in. Something is going on in these verses that the flat retelling completely misses. But before we get to how that's even possible, sit with the woman herself for a second, because the way the text handles her is genuinely odd. In verse 1, she is called Abraham's wife. The Hebrew word is Isha, wife, the same word used for Sarah. A real marriage, a real wife, named and honored. But then, only 5 verses later, when the text talks about dividing up Abraham's estate, it refers to the sons of Abraham's concubines, plural, and Keturah is clearly counted among them. And centuries later, when the book of Chronicles retells this genealogy, it does not call her his wife at all. It calls her Keturah, Abraham's concubine. So which was she, a wife or a concubine? The Bible seems to say both in the space of a few verses about the same woman. That is not a small slip. In that world, the difference between a wife and a concubine was the difference between whose children inherited and whose did not. A wife's sons were heirs. A concubine's sons got provided for, but they did not carry the line, they did not get the inheritance, they did not become the covenant family. So when the text wobbles between calling Keturah a wife and a concubine, it is not being careless. It is telling you quietly exactly where these 6 sons are going to stand in the story. Close enough to be named, not close enough to inherit. And that tension is the whole engine of what happens next. And notice one more thing the text refuses to give you, because its silence is loud. It never tells you where Keturah came from. Sarah, we know. We know her name change, her homeland, her laughter, her age, her death, her grave. Hagar, we know. We know she was Egyptian, a slave, cast out, met by an angel at a well. But Keturah arrives with nothing. No father named, no country, no backstory, no age, no death, no burial. She steps into the story already married to the most important man in it, gives him 6 sons, and vanishes. A woman who mothered nations, and the text will not even tell you where she was born. So we have a mystery woman, called both wife and concubine, who appears from nowhere and produces 6 sons in a family where one son was supposed to be a miracle. Which forces the first real question, the one the flat Sunday school version never even asks. How is Abraham fathering these children at all? Because by the time this marriage happens, according to the Bible's own numbers, Abraham is an old man, and the New Testament flatly says his body, decades earlier, was already as good as dead. Let's do the math the retellings never do, because the numbers here are almost hard to believe. The Bible gives us Abraham's age at nearly every major moment, so we can actually pin this down. Isaac is born when Abraham is 100 years old. The text says that plainly. Sarah, who was 10 years younger, lives to 127, and the Bible tells us exactly how old she was when she died, which means Abraham was 137 when he buried her. Then Isaac grows up and marries Rebekah, and the text tells us Isaac was 40 when he married, which puts Abraham right around 140. And it is right there, after Sarah's death and Isaac's wedding, that Genesis places the marriage to Keturah. So by the traditional reckoning, when Abraham takes Keturah as his wife, he is approximately 140 years old. Now the text does not stamp his exact age on the wedding day, so I will be honest and call that a calculation from the surrounding numbers rather than a printed verse. But it is a solid calculation, and it lands him at around 140. And that is not the end of his life, not even close. Abraham lives to 175. So after Sarah dies, this man has roughly 35 more years of life in front of him. 35 years. A second adult lifetime, opening up on the far side of the grave, he thought was the end of his story. And in those years, he fathers 6 sons and watches them grow, which brings us to the part that genuinely stops people, because the New Testament makes a point of telling you that Abraham's body was, physically, finished long before this. Go back to when Isaac was conceived. Abraham is 100, and when God tells him he is going to have a son, Abraham does something you rarely see him do. He falls on his face and laughs. He says, in effect, can a child be born to a man who is 100 years old? He is not being faithless so much as being realistic. He knows his own body. He knows Sarah's. The whole point of Isaac being a miracle is that by every natural measure, it should have been impossible. And the Apostle Paul, writing about this a couple of thousand years later, says it in the bluntest possible terms. He says Abraham, at that point, considered his own body as good as dead, since he was about 100 years old, and Sarah's womb was dead too. The letter to the Hebrews uses the same language, that these children came from a man as good as dead. So sit with the collision here. At 100, having one child is described as bringing life out of a dead body, a standing miracle that took direct divine intervention. And then at 140, 4 decades further into old age, the same man fathers 6 more sons without the text so much as raising an eyebrow. How? If his body was as good as dead at 100, what on earth is happening at 140? The ancient Jewish teachers noticed this exact problem, and their answer is worth hearing. They said that when God renewed Abraham's body to father Isaac, that renewal did not switch off the moment Isaac was born. The vigor that God restored to bring the one promised son into the world stayed with him. The miracle in this reading had a long tail. God brought Abraham's dead body back to life for Isaac, and that new life carried him for decades, all the way through a second marriage and 6 more sons. In that view, every one of Keturah's children is, in a sense, a lingering echo of the miracle of Isaac. They exist because of the life God poured back into a man who had already given up on his own body. Now that is a tradition, a way the rabbis filled the gap, and I will flag it as exactly that rather than as plain text. But notice what even the tradition is circling around. It is trying to make sense of a man whose story of life out of death did not stop when the famous part ended. And there is something in that which reaches straight off the page and into your own life, so hold on to it, because we are going to come back to it at the very end. Because look at what Abraham actually does here, emotionally, and it is quietly one of the most human things in the whole Bible. He has just buried Sarah. Sarah, his wife of decades, his partner in the great promise, the woman he lied about and fought for and laughed with and waited 100 years alongside. The love of his life is in a cave in the ground. A lot of men, at 137, standing over that grave, would simply sit down and wait to die. The story is over. The great romance is finished. The promised son is grown and gone. What is left? And what Abraham does is refuse to treat the grave as the end. He marries again. He builds a whole second family. He fathers and raises and provides for 6 more sons in the last third of his life, decades after the world would have written him off. The man did not close the book after Sarah. He started a new chapter that lasted 35 years. And that refusal, that stubborn insistence on more life after the deepest loss, is going to turn out to be the key to everything, including the strange question of who this second wife really was. Because there is an ancient tradition that Keturah was not a stranger to this story at all. There is a real case that Abraham, in his grief, went back and married a woman he had already loved and lost once before. Here is where this forgotten woman splits into 2 completely different people, depending on who you ask, because for as long as people have read these verses, there have been 2 very different answers to the question of who Keturah was, and they could not be further apart. The first answer is the plain one. Keturah is exactly what she looks like, a new woman, a third wife, someone Abraham married after Sarah died, with no prior connection to the story. She appears in chapter 25 because that is when she entered his life. On this reading, she is a genuinely new character, an unknown woman who became the mother of 6 of Abraham's sons late in his life, and the reason we know nothing about her background is simply that the text did not consider it central. This is the reading many careful commentators have always held, and it takes the verses at face value. But there is a second answer, and it is one of the boldest readings in all of ancient Jewish tradition. It says Keturah is not a new woman at all. It says Keturah is Hagar. Now, if you know the Abraham story, you just felt that land, because Hagar is not a minor character. Hagar was Sarah's Egyptian servant. Years before Isaac, when Sarah was still barren and desperate, she gave Hagar to Abraham to bear a child on her behalf, and Hagar became the mother of Ishmael, Abraham's firstborn son. And then it went wrong. There was jealousy and cruelty, and in the end, Sarah demanded that Hagar and Ishmael be sent away, and Abraham, grieving, put the woman and his own son out into the wilderness with a skin of water and let them go. Hagar nearly watched her boy die of thirst in the desert before God met her at a well and saved them. She is one of the most sympathetic and tragic figures in the entire book, and she walked out of Abraham's life, cast out, decades before Sarah died. So the tradition that Keturah is Hagar is making a stunning claim. It is saying that after Sarah died, after the woman who drove Hagar out was in the grave, Abraham went and found the woman he had once abandoned in the desert and brought her back and married her openly this time as a wife with a name. The great Rabbi Rashi, one of the most influential Bible commentators who ever lived, states it directly. Keturah, he says, is Hagar, and he explains the new name. He says she was called Keturah because her deeds were as beautiful and fragrant as incense, and because she had kept herself faithful, tied and closed off to any other man, from the day Abraham sent her away until the day he brought her back. In that reading, the name Keturah is not just a name, it is a tribute to a woman who waited, and the ancient sources that hold this view see it as a story of repair. Think about what it would mean. The one dark stain on Abraham's record, the thing that troubles readers most, is the casting out of Hagar and Ishmael, the abandonment of a slave woman and his own firstborn in the desert. And this tradition says that at the end of his life, Abraham went back and undid it. He restored the woman he had wronged. He took the concubine he had cast out and made her a wife. He brought her in from the wilderness and gave her 6 more sons and a place of honor. It is one of the quietest and most beautiful redemption arcs in the whole Bible, if it is true. The man who put her out in shame brought her back in love. And believe it or not, there is a thread in the text itself that the rabbis grabbed onto to support this. Go back 1 chapter to the moment Isaac first meets Rebekah. Genesis tells us exactly where Isaac was coming from when he walked out into the field that evening. He had just come from a place called Beer-lahai-roi, and that name is not random. Beer-lahai-roi means the well of the living one who sees me. It is the exact well named earlier in Genesis, where Hagar, alone and pregnant and running for her life, had once been found by the angel of God. It is Hagar's well, her place, the spot where heaven met her in the desert. So why is Isaac, the son of Sarah, coming from Hagar's well right before his father remarries? The ancient teachers had an answer that gives you chills. They said Isaac had gone there on purpose to find Hagar and to bring her back to his father. In that reading, the son himself is the one who goes into the wilderness to fetch the cast-out woman and reunite her with Abraham. And the text drops one more hint. After Abraham dies, Genesis mentions, almost in passing, that Isaac settled down and lived at that very same well, Beer-lahai-roi. The well of the woman in the desert became Isaac's home. Whether or not you take the identification all the way, the text keeps circling back to Hagar's well at exactly the moments Keturah enters and Abraham leaves. And as much as I love that redemption reading, I have to be straight with you, the way I always will be on this channel. The identification of Keturah with Hagar is a tradition, a beautiful and very old one, but it is not stated anywhere in the plain text. Genesis introduces Keturah as if she is a new person and never once says she is Hagar. And the great commentator Ibn Ezra, reading the very same verses, pushed back hard on Rashi and said the simple meaning is that Keturah was another woman entirely, not Hagar at all. So this is a genuine centuries-old disagreement between serious readers, and I'm not going to pretend it is settled, because it is not. But here is what is fascinating, and it is the thing worth carrying out of this whole section. Look at what pushed the rabbis toward reading her as Hagar in the first place. It was that wobble we already found in the text, the way the Bible calls her a wife in one verse and lumps her in with the concubines a few verses later. That doubled language, wife and concubine at once, is exactly what you would expect if this woman had been both. A concubine first, long ago, and then a wife at the end. The tradition did not come from nowhere. It grew out of a real seam in the text, a genuine tension the plain reading leaves unexplained. Whether or not Keturah was literally Hagar, the Bible is doing something strange with her status, and both readings are wrestling with the same odd fact on the page. And notice that both answers, in the end, land on the same emotional truth. Whether Keturah was a new woman Abraham married in his grief, or Hagar returned from the desert he once sent her into, the story is the same at its core. It is the story of a very old man who buried his great love and then chose, against every expectation, to love again and to build again, and to father a whole new branch of humanity in the years everyone assumed were only for waiting to die, which finally lets us ask the question we came here for. What happened to those 6 sons? Because the text is about to do something to them that seems, at first, almost cruel. It names them, and then it sends them away. Here is what Abraham does with these 6 sons, and it is one of the most quietly loaded moments in Genesis. The text says 2 things, right next to each other, and you have to hold them together to feel the weight. First, it says Abraham gave all that he had to Isaac. Everything. The whole inheritance, the covenant, the land, the promise, the future, all of it goes to one son. And then in the very next breath, it says that to the sons of his concubines, Abraham gave gifts, and he sent them away from Isaac his son, eastward to the east country, while he was still alive. Read that slowly, because it is doing something very deliberate. Isaac gets everything that matters. The 6 sons of Keturah get gifts, presents, a payout, and a one-way road east into the desert. away from the promised land, away from the covenant line, away from the story. Abraham does it himself while he is still living, so there can be no fight over it after he dies. He separates them out. He provides for them generously, and then he removes them from the inheritance, on purpose, with his own hands. And I know how that sounds to a modern ear. It sounds cold. It sounds like a father playing favorites, showering one son with everything and buying the other 6 off with a bag of gifts and a shove toward the horizon. But watch what the text is really telling you, because it is not about Abraham being cruel. It is about how this whole book understands the promise. From the very beginning, the covenant was never about how many children Abraham could produce. It was about one specific line, chosen by God, carrying one specific promise. Ishmael, the firstborn, was already set aside from that line, loved and blessed and made into a great nation of his own, but not the covenant son. And now these 6 are set aside the same way, not cursed, not hated, blessed with gifts and sent to become peoples of their own. But the promise runs through Isaac, and the text will not let anything blur that. And there is something buried in that one direction, east, that a first-time reader flies right past, but the writer of Genesis chose very deliberately. Because in this book, east is never a neutral compass point. East is the direction of leaving. When Adam and Eve are driven out of the garden, they go east, and God posts an angel with a flaming sword on the east side of Eden. When Cain is sent away from God's presence for killing his brother, he settles east of Eden, in a land called Nod, the land of wandering. When humanity builds the Tower of Babel in its arrogance, the text says they had journeyed from the east. When Lot drifts away from Abraham and chooses the rich land towards Sodom, he travels east. Over and over in Genesis, moving east means moving away, out of the garden, out of the blessing, out of the presence. So when Abraham sends the sons of Keturah eastward, to the east country, the direction itself is part of the message. They are not just being handed a location, they are being placed gently on the outside of the covenant, in the very direction this whole book uses for everyone who leaves the center, which is exactly what makes what happens to them next so surprising. But here is where it gets fascinating, because being sent away from the covenant did not mean disappearing from the Bible. Just the opposite. Those 6 sons and the grandsons that came from them went east and became nations, real nations with names you will recognize that come roaring back into the biblical story hundreds of years later. And the biggest of them all is a name that anyone who knows the story of Moses will sit straight up at. Because one of Keturah's 6 sons was named Midian. Midian, the father of the Midianites. And if you know your Bible, you know that the Midianites are absolutely everywhere in the story that follows. Go forward 400 years to Moses. When Moses kills the Egyptian and flees Egypt for his life, where does he run? He runs to the land of Midian. And there, at a well, he meets 7 sisters, and he defends them, and he ends up marrying one of them, Zipporah. And her father, the priest of Midian, a man named Jethro, becomes Moses' father-in-law, his mentor, the man who advises him on how to lead the whole nation of Israel. Sit with that connection for a second. Moses, the greatest prophet in the Hebrew Bible, married into Midian, which means, if you follow the genealogy back, Moses married a descendant of Abraham through Keturah. The wife of Moses came from the line of the forgotten woman. Think about what that means. The 6 sons everyone treats as a dead end, a branch pruned off the family tree and sent into the desert, produced the very people who would shelter Moses, feed him, marry him, and counsel him at the birth of the entire nation of Israel. The forgotten branch circled back and touched the main story at one of its most important moments. Keturah's line and Sarah's line, separated by Abraham with his own hands, met again 4 centuries later at a well in the wilderness, and out of that meeting came the marriage of Moses himself. And that right there, the forgotten branch reaching all the way into the life of Moses, is the reason this channel exists. If you want more of these threads that the quick retellings leave lying on the floor, take 1 second and subscribe. It genuinely helps these deeper readings reach the people who would want them. But I have to tell you the rest of the Midian story, because it does not stay warm. The relationship between Israel and Midian curdles. By the time Israel is coming out of the wilderness, the Midianites have become enemies. They join with Moab to hire the prophet Balaam to curse Israel. There is a terrible episode at a place called Peor, where Midianite women lead Israel into idolatry, and it ends in a war in which Midian is devastated. And centuries after that, in the time of the judges, the Midianites come sweeping in like locusts every harvest, stealing everything, until a farmer named Gideon, with 300 men and torches hidden in clay jars, breaks their power in one of the most famous battles in the Old Testament. The descendants of Keturah's son Midian went from sheltering Moses to fighting Israel for survival. One bloodline and centuries of both marriage and war with the people of the promise. And here is the part that should make you lean in, because Midian is just the loudest of the 6. The other 5 left their fingerprints on the Bible too, in places you would never think to look. 2 of the grandsons, Sheba and Dedan, became famous trading peoples of Arabia, names that show up again and again in the prophets as wealthy merchant nations of the Far East. Another son, Shua, is very likely the origin of a people called the Shuhites, and here is a connection most people never make. One of the 3 friends who comes to sit with Job in his suffering in that ancient book is named Bildad the Shuhite, which means one of the men in the oldest story of suffering in the Bible may well have been a descendant of Abraham through Keturah. These were not nobodies. The children Abraham sent east became merchants and tribes and kingdoms, woven quietly through the rest of Scripture, hiding in plain sight under names we read right past. So the 6 sons that Genesis seems to brush off the page in a single verse did not vanish. They became a huge slice of the ancient world, the peoples of Arabia and the eastern deserts, tribes of traders and warriors and shepherds spreading out from one old man's late marriage, which brings us back to the promise, the one everybody quotes and nobody connects to this. Because God did not tell Abraham he would be the father of one nation, he told him something much bigger, and it is Keturah more than anyone who quietly made those exact words come true. Now we come to her name, because her name is the secret the whole story has been keeping. Keturah. In Hebrew, the name comes from a root, QTR, and that root has a very specific meaning. It means to burn incense, to send up fragrant smoke, the smoke of an offering rising toward heaven. The same root gives Hebrew its word for incense itself, Ketoret, the sacred perfumed smoke that was burned in the tabernacle and the temple, the fragrance that stood for prayer going up to God. So the name Keturah does not mean something ordinary, it means roughly incense, the perfumed one, the one associated with the rising sacred smoke. Abraham's forgotten wife carried in her very name the word for the holiest fragrance in Israel's worship. And at first, that just seems like a lovely coincidence, a pretty name. But then you follow where her children went, and the coincidence stops being a coincidence and starts feeling like the whole point. Because remember where Abraham sent these 6 sons? East, to the east country, into Arabia and the deserts beyond the Jordan. And what was the ancient East? The land of Sheba and Dedan and Midian and Ephah, most famous for in the entire ancient world. Incense, frankincense and myrrh and spices. The lands where Keturah's descendants settled were the source of the great incense trade. the caravan routes that carried frankincense and gold up out of Arabia to the temples and palaces of the whole known world. The woman whose name means incense became the mother of the incense nations. Her children went east and built their wealth for 1,000 years on the very fragrant smoke her name was made from. And here is where it closes into something almost too neat to be accidental. Because that frankincense, the resin from the incense lands of the East, did not just make those peoples rich. It ended up in the one place that mattered most to Israel, the sacred incense that burned on the golden altar inside the tabernacle, and later inside the temple in Jerusalem, the holy smoke that rose in front of God twice a day, every day, for 1,000 years, was made from those Eastern spices. Frankincense is named directly in the recipe God hands Moses for it. Think about what that means. The fragrance that stood for the prayers of Israel going up to heaven, the smoke in the holiest room on earth, was carried in on the caravans of the peoples, descended from the woman named Incense. Her children grew the frankincense. Israel burned it before God. So every single day that a priest lit the incense in the temple, the perfume of Keturah's name and the trade of Keturah's sons was rising up in the presence of the God who had promised her husband a multitude of nations. The forgotten wife's name was quite literally in the air of the holy place. And this is not me stretching to force a pattern, because the Bible itself makes the connection explicit. Open the book of Isaiah, chapter 60, a soaring prophecy about the nations streaming to the light of God. And listen to the names Isaiah reaches for. He says, "A multitude of camels will cover the land, the young camels of Midian and Ephah." Midian, Keturah's son. Ephah, Keturah's grandson, Midian's own boy. Isaiah names them directly. And then he says, "All those from Sheba will come, bringing gold and frankincense." Sheba, another of Keturah's grandsons, 3 of Keturah's direct descendants, named in one prophetic breath. And what are they carrying? Gold and frankincense, the gifts of the incense lands, brought by the children of the woman named Incense. And if that combination, the Eastern peoples bringing gold and frankincense to the glory of God, sounds familiar, it should. Because there is one more place in the Bible where travelers come from the East, carrying gold and frankincense to worship. Turn to the very beginning of the New Testament, to the birth of Jesus. Wise men from the East come looking for a newborn king, and they open their treasures and they lay down gifts, gold, frankincense, and myrrh. The exact treasures of the incense trade, carried by men from the exact direction Abraham sent Keturah's sons, laid at the feet of a child in Bethlehem. Now I want to be careful here, because this is exactly the kind of connection that is easy to overclaim, and honesty is the whole point of this channel. The New Testament does not tell us the wise men were literally Keturah's descendants. It does not give their genealogy at all. So I am not going to stand here and tell you as a fact that the Magi were the children of Keturah. What I can tell you is that they came from the same East, carrying the same gifts, the gold and frankincense of the same incense lands, that the prophets tied to Keturah's line, and that many readers across the centuries have seen exactly that echo and felt the circle close. The woman whose name means incense, whose sons became the incense nations of the East, standing quietly behind the moment when the East brings its incense to the newborn king. Whether by bloodline or by beautiful design, the fragrance that started in her name ends up rising over a manger. And that is when this whole forgotten marriage suddenly comes into focus, because it connects back to the biggest promise in Abraham's entire life. Go back to the covenant. When God changes his name from Abram to Abraham, God tells him exactly what the new name means. He says, "I have made you a father of many nations." Not a nation, many nations, a multitude of nations. And Abraham at the time has no children at all. It is the most impossible promise in the book. And we tend to think that promise was fulfilled through Isaac, through Israel, one nation, the chosen people. But read the words again, many nations. One nation was never going to be enough to make those words true. So count them. Through Isaac came Israel. Through Ishmael came 12 princes and the peoples of the northern deserts. And through Keturah came Midian and Sheba and Dedan and the Shuhites and a whole cluster of the nations of Arabia and the east. It is only when you add Keturah's 6 sons to the picture that Abraham actually becomes what God said he would be, the father of many nations, plural, a multitude. The forgotten wife is not a footnote to the promise. She is part of how the promise came true. Without Keturah, Abraham is the father of 2 lines. With her, he is the father of a world of peoples, exactly as many as the words required. The marriage nobody preaches is one of the main reasons the most famous promise in Genesis was not an exaggeration. So the woman the text seems embarrassed to mention turns out to be load-bearing. She helped fulfill the covenant. She mothered the incense nations. Her line touched Moses and echoed all the way to Bethlehem. And yet, when you go looking for how her own story ends, the Bible does something that, after everything we have just seen, is genuinely hard to take. It gives her nothing, not a death, not a grave, not even a goodbye. Let's talk about the silence at the end of Keturah's life, because it is the last piece of the mystery. Here is the last thing the text does with Keturah, and it is a kind of disappearing act. When Abraham dies, at 175, the Bible gives him a real ending. It tells us his age, it tells us he was gathered to his people, and it tells us that his sons, Isaac and Ishmael, came together to bury him in the same cave where Sarah lay, the cave of Machpelah, the family grave Abraham had bought with his own silver. Sarah is there. Abraham is laid beside her. The great love story is sealed, in the end, in a shared tomb. And there is something quietly moving buried in that funeral, if you have been paying attention. Because look at who shows up to bury Abraham, Isaac and Ishmael, together, the son of Sarah and the son of Hagar, the boy who inherited everything and the boy who was cast into the desert, standing side by side at their father's grave. 2 brothers, separated by their mothers decades earlier, reunited at the end to bury the old man they shared. And if the tradition we talked about is right, if Keturah really was Hagar brought home, then Ishmael standing at that grave is the son of the woman Abraham married twice. Come back into the family at the very end. The cast-out son, present at the burial, because somewhere in those last 35 years the family had been quietly stitched back together. But Keturah gets none of this. The text that told us Sarah's exact age at death, that lingered over her burial, that named the cave and the field and the price Abraham paid for it, says nothing at all about how Keturah's life ended. The text gives us no age, no death scene, no grave at all. We are not told she was buried with Abraham, and by all appearances she was not, because that tomb was Sarah's. The woman who gave Abraham 6 sons and helped make him the father of many nations simply slips off the page the same way she slipped onto it, without ceremony, without a marker, without a goodbye. The mother of nations has no recorded grave, and it would be easy to read that silence as one more insult, the final erasure of a woman the tradition never valued. But sit with it a moment longer, because there is another way to hear it, and I think it is truer. The text does not need to mark Keturah's grave, because her monument was never going to be a stone. Her monument is the map. It is Midian and Sheba and Dedan. It is the caravans and the incense and the trade routes of the east. It is Moses' wife at a well, and the gifts over a manger, and the words father of many nations finally coming true. She has no tomb because she did not need one. The nations are her grave marker. You cannot carve a name that large into a single rock. So the questions we started with finally have their answers, and when you lay them all out, the sentence everyone reads past stops being a footnote and becomes one of the most quietly important lines in the book. Let's bring it home. We started with the family everyone thinks they know: Abraham, Sarah, Isaac, 3 people. And we found, hidden in 5 verses after the funeral, a whole second family the retellings quietly drop. Who was Keturah? A wife, a mother of 6, and possibly Hagar herself, brought home from the desert Abraham once sent her into. How does a man as good as dead at 100 father 6 sons at 140? Because the life God poured back into him for Isaac never ran out, and because he refused to let a grave be the end of his story. What happened to those 6 sons? They went east and became nations, Midian and Sheba, and the incense peoples, and they came back to touch Moses, and Job, and the prophets, and maybe even the manger. And why did the Bible mention them at all, only to send them away? Because they were how the oldest promise came true: father of many nations, not one, many. And Keturah is a chapter of that promise the church forgot to read. But here is the part I actually can't stop thinking about, and it is not about the nations. It is about the old man at the grave. Abraham was 137. He had buried the love of his life. Everything the world tells you your story is for was behind him. And instead of sitting down in that tent to wait for the end, he loved again, and he built again, and he became a father again, and the last third of his life produced more than the first 2 combined. Nobody would have blamed him for stopping. He didn't stop. And if you have ever stood over the grave of something you thought was the whole point of your life, a person, a marriage, a calling, a version of yourself, and quietly assumed the rest was just waiting, Keturah is in the Bible to tell you that God is not always finished when you are sure he must be. Sometimes the forgotten chapter is the one that fathers nations. That is the whole reason this channel exists. To open the book back up and read the skipped-over places where the truth turns out to be closer to your own life than anyone told you. If this changed how you see even one verse, subscribe, because there is a thread we left hanging tonight. We said Keturah's son Midian sheltered Moses and then became his enemy, and that a Midianite priest named Jethro taught Moses how to lead a nation. That priest, an outsider from the forgotten branch, may have shaped Israel more than almost anyone realizes, and his story is stranger than you think. That video is on screen right now. I think you'll want to know how the forgotten branch comes all the way back.